Welcome into episode 390 of the Skate Podcast. I am Brian DeFelice, joined by Bridget Peru and Scott McLaughlin. Before we get into the Bruins loss down in Tampa Bay, just a PSA that we will be doing a mailbag episode sometime next week, Scott. Is that correct?
Yeah, we figured Bruins play Saturday, Tuesday, and then have a little break until next Saturday. So we figured sometime late next week we'll do a mailbag episode without any games those couple days. So yeah, send us questions on Twitter/X at the skatepod. You can email us skatepod at weei.com. Comment on YouTube, all the usual ways.
And I should
send a
say
letter to Scott, just like write in a letter, send it to Scott's address, hand deliver it.
Yeah, pen and ink.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe
carrier pigeon.
I should say since we last recorded, it was announced that the Bruins and their opponent from tonight, the Tampa Bay Lightning, will be facing each other. Is it next February of 2026 in the Stadium Series down in Tampa Bay? So there is some news there. But before we get to our thoughts on that, there was a game tonight down in Tampa Bay. Bruins lose 4-1. The slide continues. They've lost now 6 games. So, hey, it can only get worse, right? I mean, or better. I don't really know what to think with this team anymore.
Well, yeah,
I mean, talk about the Stadium Series because I'd rather talk about that.
Yeah, I was gonna say the problem is it can actually get worse because next up on the schedule is the Florida Panthers, and you should get up for that game no matter what. You should get up for it to try to snap a 6-game losing streak, and yet we know that Panthers team has the Bruins number, and that could go really south, and you could see that be a disaster, or maybe it becomes some sort of rallying cry. But for now, we will focus on this Tampa game. It's the Bruins' first 6-game losing streak in almost 10 years. Since March of 2015 was their last 6-game losing streak. They have not had a losing streak longer than 6 games since January of 2010, January to February 2010. So they're not in a good spot, guys. I guess we can probably get right into opening shifts because mine is about special teams once again being a turning point in the game that goes against the Bruins. And I know we sound like a broken record, but we have to keep talking about it because it keeps happening. It's a 0-0 game late in the second period. Each team has kind of had a little bit of a push at times. The Bruins actually had the momentum at this point in the game. They had a couple of good shifts in the offensive zone, draw a penalty, go on a power play, which we know is the way that they're going right now, going to kill any momentum. And sure enough, David Pastrnak stick handles into traffic, turns it over on an entry. Mason Lohrei gets beat going the other way by Brandon Hagel. His shot is, goes wide. Swayman completely loses track of where the puck goes. He's looking over the wrong shoulder, or maybe he's looking at Hagel because he thinks he bumped him. And by the time he recovers, Anthony Cirelli's teeing up a slap shot that beats him over the shoulder. No one from the Bruins is back checking. Just a complete disaster. Just the kind of deflating sequence that we are seeing from this power play over and over again. And it's getting worse to where it's like, okay, not only are they not scoring, then they're not even generating positive momentum on the power play. Now, not only are they not doing that, they're giving up shorthanded goals against. And it's like, I don't know what else to say about it. They changed up Sacco changed up the units again, to units that he tried a couple games ago, but nothing works. The players aren't executing. There's a lack of effort. They make the same mistakes over and over again. Pastrnak on that entry, skating into traffic. It's like, how often do you have to do that before it gets through that doesn't work? That you can't do it. I don't know. I thought the game was fairly even outside of that, like each team has one 5-on-5 goal. The Lightning run up the score late. They get an empty netter and then another power play goal in the final minute. But like that goal, that shorthanded goal is the moment. Like that's what decides the game.
Yeah, it is. And like if Don Sweeney loses his job, power play is going to be right at the top of the reasons why. Like and you know what? That's on coaches too. Like but it's the players' confidence is very clearly off. We've heard some players admit that, like Zadorov came right out and said confidence is an issue. Whether or not other guys would say it or not, like some of the power play issues come down to confidence. And I think my opening shift has to do with Mason Lohrei, and he's been on the second power play unit. He was on the ice for that shorthanded goal against. He got beat. He was also, him and Peak were also on the ice for the other of the two first goals by Tampa Bay. That pair continues to struggle. But I mean, this is just such a microcosm of a game for Mason Lohrei because he's on the ice for those two goals against. And then he scores and he finds a lane. He makes a nice move to find an open shooting lane. He scores. He makes an individual play. And it wasn't the Bruins had a lot of good other opportunities they didn't finish on, but this was the one that they did. And it was an up and down game for him. But I do feel like in the losing streak, it's been a net negative when he's been on the ice with Peak. And I think, Scott, last episode you said, I'm ready for that pair to be done for a while. And then they come out, they go back to it. It didn't work again. And your question is like, we come back to this because this hasn't happened yet, but like, do you have Lohrei spend some time on the ninth floor just to maybe get right? But he also was the one who scored. And then, or do you just mix up the pairs and put them back with McAvoy? Like maybe something like that helps. But yeah, I think Mason Lohrei was pretty prominent for positive and negative reasons in this loss against Tampa Bay. And before we get to Brian's opening shift, and maybe this actually transitions to your shift, I'm not exactly sure what yours is, but I know last episode I said Florida has been the knockout punch for the Bruins the last two playoffs, but could they be the knockout punch in the regular season if they lose this upcoming game to Florida? And that would put them on a 7-game losing streak. Like that would be another big blow, even though it doesn't come in the playoffs. The Bruins have slid backwards. Tampa just passed them in the standings for that third spot in the Atlantic. So
And really, Tampa was already ahead of them. Like they were a good ways ahead of them on points percentage.
Yes. My point being,
I mean, the Bruins are out of a playoff spot now after this loss.
That was my point, is like they're sliding and Florida has a chance to give them like a regular season punch right now, like a big blow to them in the regular season if they can beat them and put them on a 7-game losing streak.
Yeah, it is a good segue, Bridget. And if the Bruins, really had any sort of character this year, they could also look at the next game against Florida and on the flip side say, you know what, maybe we're at rock bottom right now. Maybe a strong win against this Panthers team can maybe help catapult us in the right direction. Obviously, I don't think that that's going to happen. And Scott mentioned how the Bruins need to get up for this game against the Panthers. Well, that kind of reminds me of a game I thought they should have been up for against the Panthers way back in October, which is where I had my first red flag for this team on the season. Yes, I didn't think that their training camp was great, but I remember saying to you guys after that season opener, you're going down to Florida to play the Panthers. They're raising their Stanley Cup banner. They've knocked you out of the playoffs back-to-back years. If you can't get up for this game and start the season off with the emotion that this game entails, then I don't know what to say. And if you remember, the Bruins, more or less kind of no-showed that game. And to me at the time, even though it was just one game, I was like, how do you knock it up for this one? And for the next couple of months, they, their coach gets fired due to the players' lack of chemistry, execution, effort, all of those things. And not that Montgomery was blameless, but you guys get my point. And I just feel like the Bruins just got away. They were getting away with, not playing a strong brand of hockey, yet they were still in playoff positioning. And I feel like now, during this 6-game losing streak, I think it's catching up to them a little bit. I think they're kind of getting what they deserve. I'm not saying that over the 6-game losing streak, they haven't worked hard at times and played well at times, but generally speaking, they're getting right now what they deserve. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the standings right now, how costly is this losing streak? Okay. The Bruins are now 6th place in the Atlantic Division, 11th place in the Eastern Conference, and 21st in the NHL if we're going off of point percentage. All right, there's 38 games remaining. Bridget and Scott, the clock is ticking. So last week we sat here and I mentioned I don't like the way this team is trending, and I think there's concern about them making the playoffs or not. And at the time, you guys were a little bit more optimistic than not. I'm going to ask you the same question. Given where they are in the standings right now, given there's 38 games left and they're not playing great and they still have a tough month of hockey ahead, has your optimism lessened in just a week?
Well, yeah, it has to. They've lost 6 in a row. That certainly puts a massive dent in any optimism. Look, like, taking a step back, like I still think they're better than these teams near them in the standings, or they should be. Like, they should be better than Columbus, Montreal, Pittsburgh, Detroit coming up behind them. Like, again, like, their roster is better than those teams.
Is it?
They are capable of playing better hockey than those teams, but they are what they are. Like, this is what they've been playing all season. They have a huge number of underachievers. They don't play coherently for any long stretch of time.
Do you mean cohesively?
Well, either one, cohesively or coherently.
I always think of coherently as like somebody's really drunk, so they're incoherent.
I mean, does that not apply?
I don't know.
Scott, can you elaborate a little bit further though? Like, let's just take a random team that you mentioned. Let's take an Ottawa or a Columbus. Like, is the Bruins roster that much better?
Like, Ottawa, I think, might actually be a playoff team. Like, I also elevate Ottawa above the rest of that group. Obviously, they're hurting right now because Linus Ullmark is hurting.
Right.
He missed time. So, but yeah, I guess my take is more like, I kind of think all those other teams stink, and the Bruins should not stink, but right now they do. So
they do. That's the problem. Yeah, they do stink.
I mean,
all their team metrics stink. They're 44 games into the year. They kind of stink, Scott.
I'd say for most of December, like, the Bruins played better hockey than any of those teams have or are capable of playing. Like, the Bruins are one of the 2 or 3 best defensive teams in the NHL for like a month and a half. None of those other teams are capable of doing that, but the Bruins either can't or don't want to do that on a consistent basis. Like, they haven't been able to stick with it. And it's, I've referenced before, like, it's a hard way to play. And it's why the other night after the game, I asked Brad Marchand, like, is it hard to play that defensive style for a full regular season? And he said, well, not if you're committed to it. Well, they don't look committed to it. And they obviously haven't been able to figure out special teams at all, and it continues to kill them. So, it doesn't really matter if I think they're a better team or should be a better team, or they are capable of being a better team. The fact is they're not right now. Like you laid it out. They got past, I think Columbus, Montreal, and Pittsburgh all moved ahead of them on points percentage Thursday night. With that loss, 2 of those teams won. At Montreal, I don't think played, but so it's like you are where you are, as Bill Parcells famously said. You are what your record says you are.
I mean, in the Eastern Conference right now, the only teams behind the Bruins on points percentage are the Rangers, who have beaten the Bruins in the last month, the Islanders, who have beaten the Bruins in the last week, the Flyers, who I think, what are they, 2-1 against the Bruins this year, or 1-1? But I mean, they've shut the Bruins out. So the Bruins are only ahead of 4 teams in the East, and the teams that they're ahead of have honestly beaten the Bruins this year. So yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, Scott, they did play a good stretch of defense, but ultimately, when you can't score, your defense is going to get tired of defending. Now, defense can lead to offense, but yeah, I mean, it's no secret. Like, this team offensively doesn't have much of anything beyond their top player, and he isn't having a season that he's used to. And I don't know if you guys noticed Charlie McAvoy in a Bruins TikTok. Look, the Bruins got stuck in the elevator with their moms or something like that, and there was a video, and it looked like McAvoy's right wrist had some sort of cast on it, so he might be playing through something. Yeah, I don't know. This Bruins roster, if you watch the Canadians play, if you watch the Senators play or the Blue Jackets, they have players that they can stick handle in a phone booth. The puck's on a string. They have defense that can skate. I would sit here and say, pure talent. If you were to take away the Bruins' top 2 players and then every other team's top 2 players, the rest of the rosters, I feel like Boston's got less talent than everybody else. Certainly not more talent than most people. Like, if you take away Pastrnak and call it McAvoy, and then take away Brady Tkachuk and Jake Sanderson or whatever, I just don't think the Bruins have that much of that great of a roster compared to everybody else.
But they do have a Pastrnak and McAvoy, which
no, I know, but
should be an
else,
advantage over a lot of teams.
Sure,
but they haven't been this year. And
sure.
Jeremy Swayman should give you an advantage in goal over Elvis Merzlikins and Sam Montembeault and Tristan Jarry. But he's not this year because he's not playing up to his caliber. So again, it's like,
yeah,
on paper, they are better than those teams. But the game isn't played on paper, and on the ice, they're not performing.
Yeah, and because I haven't had a chance to answer this, I'll try to make it quick. But to go back to am I still as optimistic that they'll make the playoffs as I was a week ago? No, because they keep losing, and they're even losing when their effort is good. Like, there's been third period efforts in this, I say more often than not in this 6-game skid, that they're out efforting teams, or they at least have a push where they can tie it, and it just doesn't happen. And then that kind of does come back down to the personnel and the finishing and the roster. And when you bring up the skill difference, or who has a better roster among those teams that are kind of in competition for the final wild card spot, it's like, on paper, what did we say before the season? We thought this was a good roster. Like, this should, by all accounts, based on history of different players, been a winning formula. And it has just not, it is underperformed from where we thought this entire season. And then so we were saying that, start of the year, we're like, this on paper should be a really good team. They picked up a new center. They needed a center. They got a big, tough defenseman. That'll be good in the playoffs. They signed Swayman. He's a good goalie. Yeah, they lose Allmark, but they still have Swayman. Shouldn't be an issue. So there was logical reasons why this should have been a good team on paper. But if you're assuming, that's when you're assuming Pastrnak is going to play up to his numbers, and when you're assuming that Elias Lindholm is going to come in and put up numbers of a number 1 or number 2 center, and the rest of the team is going to be committed and have the effort that we've seen in the past 2 seasons, even though they haven't made deep playoff runs, we've seen those efforts in the past. And it just hasn't worked out that way. And then we get to mid-November, say, when we're at the point where Montgomery's about to get fired. And we're saying, oh my gosh, this team needs to add something. This roster needs something different. And then Montgomery gets fired. They start playing better. We're like, okay, we'll rethink that. Let's take a step back. Maybe it was, they just needed a coaching change. They needed a kick in the ass. They needed that little spark. And it worked for a little bit, but now we're right back to that conversation where it's like, it seems like an outside answer has to come in at some point, because the answer hasn't been there in the last 6 games that were losses, and the roster has underperformed. So what is the next thing you can do to get them back on track? But if you're really being honest with yourself, this isn't the roster that it's going to take to make the playoffs or win in the playoffs.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes a mix of guys just has an off year. Like that happens. And I think the reality of the situation is that last season the Bruins overachieved on an individual basis in a lot of circumstances and as a team. That roster heading into the season, none of us, I mean, we were saying maybe a bubble team at best, right? Heading into last season when you lose Bergeron and Krejci, and then you have Zacha and Coyle as your number 1 and number 2 centers. I mean,
I thought they were still firmly a playoff team. Like,
okay, but you get my point though. Like, I mean, you go from Bergeron to Krejci to Coyle Zacha, it was just like a lessened expectation. And if they make the playoffs, great. But I think Coyle putting up 60 points last year, just like what you saw last year was a lot of individuals have career highs, and what you're seeing this year is a lot of those same individuals, on pace for like career lows / paces they haven't done in a decade. So it was 2 extremes. It was the best of these players, and now it's the worst of these players. And what you haven't seen is just like them playing, what they should be. And I think, I'm not going to sit here and defend Don Sweeney. I'm not a Don Sweeney defender. I'm also not a Don Sweeney hater. But I will say one thing in his defense that I feel like isn't getting said much is, if you want to blame Sweeney for the construction of the roster, like, go for it. But if you're Don Sweeney, like, how is he supposed to project that David Pastrnak would score 35 less points than what he normally does, or that like Charlie McAvoy would be a shell of himself? Like, those should have been, if I'm Sweeney, I'm like, those are certainties.
Yeah,
that those guys are going to perform.
Charlie Coyle's going to score less than half as many points as last year. Pavel Zacha is going to score 20 to 25 fewer. Like, yeah, like that's the thing, is like, yeah, you can account for, okay, maybe everyone's not going to reach a career high again. There's no way to predict like 8 core guys having career worst years. Like, and including Swayman. You mentioned McAvoy and Pastrnak. Like, yeah, like you can't. Yeah, so clearly Sweeney didn't build a Stanley Cup roster. Like, got it. That's where I come back and say, like, it should be a playoff roster. You have that many guys underachieving, and you're still on the, even with the 6-game losing streak, you're still right on the bubble. I mean, your percentage points out of a playoff spot. But yeah, like it's impossible to predict that. And you're right. Like, sometimes for whatever reason, a group just has an off year and can't pull out of it. But I would say, like, then, okay, now then it is on Don Sweeney to find a way to inject something into it, find a way to spark something. Another like broken record take, but like, you can start with just calling it a guy or 2 up. Like, you can start there. That doesn't require any kind of trade or big shakeup, but like, you should also be open to a big shakeup. I saw on TSN Thursday night, Darren Dreger, one of his things was, he said the Bruins are open for business, but then he also kind of said something about how like they're like planning out for the March 7th trade deadline and starting to like come up with a plan over the next 2 months. And I'm like, so are they open for business, or are they planning for 2 months from now? So that's like a little confusing, but like, they absolutely should be open to making a trade now, to doing something to shake it up.
He should have been open for business since November. Like,
well, and he said he was. He said,
yeah.
if and the team obviously did improve a little after that, but yeah, he said like, if the coaching change didn't change things, that he would keep making changes. So far, we haven't seen him make any other changes.
Yeah, and not clearly not enough was done. And like Brian said, like, we're not defending Don Sweeney, but there's definitely a lot going on that he has to try to fix now that were not foreseeable really in the preseason. And when you looked at the roster that was put together on paper, it wasn't. I wouldn't have been able to predict it, so I don't know how he would have been able to. Not saying I'm smarter than him, but like I think just generally most people wouldn't have been able to predict it. I know that's what it sounded like for a second, but that's not what I mean. I just think you couldn't see it coming. Maybe we needed to get like a psychic on the podcast and see what, like, she reads the cards and she looks into the ball and she's like, "Ooh, okay, Don Sweeney, you need to trade for this." No, I'm just kidding. I don't believe in that either.
I think Greg Hill used to have a psychic on, like on definitely on his old AAF show, and I think he came on EI a few times too. I'm blanking on the name now, but
I just want to put this for the record that I don't believe in that stuff. But I was joking.
I mean, sometimes I'm a psychic. Like sometimes I have premonitions.
Yeah.
Are we sure? Yeah. Are you doing okay, Scott? Are you?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay.
Nothing right now.
You got any visions you want to share with us?
Nothing. I'm too tired right now.
So, well, that's actually probably when you get your best visions. Honestly, you like hallucinating somewhat.
So look, to play devil's advocate, because if we sit here and say, if you're Don Sweeney, how would you possibly expect Pasternak to score 75 points instead of 110, or Swayman to have a 888 save percentage instead of 9 whatever? A devil's advocate could say, well, Bridget, Brian, Scott, like maybe if he wasn't playing with Morgan Geekie, Pasternak would have somebody to play off of. And the thing there is, okay, sure, like I don't even dispute that Pasternak should have line mates, that are true top 6 players and top 3 players, I should say. But last year he had 110 points, and it was, the talent on his line. I mean, he played with Zaka and JVR, and then Zaka and Heinen, and Zaka and Geekie, and like you name it. So now you could say it was fool's luck for a year, sure, but I'm just saying, like.
But he also was able to generate it on his own last year,
right? And he should be, because when you're that good of a player. Does it look to you guys like the speed of the league is catching up to Pasternak? Like, don't look now, but he's been in the league for 10 years. And I'm not saying he's a slow player, but like when he first broke into the league, you could, his speed was evident. Now he's just, a good skater out there. Do you think that, for some of these guys, maybe the league's catching up a little bit as it pertains to speed and skill?
Maybe, but it doesn't really seem like it doesn't feel like a foot speed problem to me. At times, I think his processing and decision making seems slower. And like maybe that's part of it, but I don't know. I just feel like everything about his game looks off. Like I know people have harped on, he turns the puck over too much or whatever. I've always said, like, the guys who have the puck a lot lead the league in turnovers. Like, that's just how it is. To me, it looks sloppier. Like, even outside of like clean turnovers, it's just like the fumbling, the not handling passes cleanly, not making passes cleanly. The finishing has been off. Like, he's not burying shots the same way as usual. I've highlighted before that he's settling for lower quality shots. I think some chances that he set up last year that his line mates buried, they're not burying this year. Other even non-line mates. I mean, he sets up Johnny Beecher for what should have been a tap-in. That they're kind of in between line changes. Thursday night should be a tap-in. Beecher has about 80% of the net to shoot at, and he puts it back across the crease right into Vasilevsky. That's just one example, but like it all just piles up, and then again, like comes back to the power play. Pasternak's getting no points on the power play because the power play isn't scoring. And he's partly to blame for it because he's the one who turned it over Thursday night, leading to a shorthanded goal. He's been the problem at other times. But they also don't have the talent elsewhere on the power play to free him up, to set him up. So yeah, like it all adds together, and it's like, yeah, that's how you end up with 30 or 35 fewer points, or on pace for that.
Yeah, I bring up his age just because not even so much like for the question I just asked, but in my mind, Pasternak has just forever been like 25. And he actually, I mean, he turns 29 at the end of the season. Like his birthday is May 25th. So before the Stanley Cup is won this year by somebody, he'll be 29. And he's my point is like he's getting
a young soul.
He has a young soul. But this Bruins core of Pasternak and McAvoy, they are in their late 20s. Like they're approaching their late 20s into their early 30s in the next couple of seasons. They're not kids anymore. And there's a lot of people talking about like is McAvoy regressing? Is he overrated? Do you guys have any long-term concerns about these two pillars of the Bruins as it pertains to being elite players on the ice? Like, do you think would you consider McAvoy an elite NHL defenseman at this point, or a very good one? And is there any concern with these players that they are going to continue to be who they've been, and this year might just be an outlier?
I'm hesitant to answer that like definitively because once again, not a psychic, but it could be a down year. There could be injury issues involved with either of them, or like at least something that they're banged up enough to not look like themselves. I think if you caught me in my like private life, I'd probably give you more of a a reaction to it. But like professionally speaking, I just don't think I would go far enough to say that that McAvoy isn't at least a very good defenseman, and that I'm concerned about Pasternak. Like it, I don't know. Yeah. I wouldn't go so far, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I still view McAvoy as a very good defenseman. He would be the number one D on at least half the teams in the NHL. I don't think you can call him elite because the offense hasn't reached that level. And specifically the power play work has not been anywhere close to that level. I mean, he's a negative on the power play, quite frankly. Like he takes away value. Like he loses value because of how much power play time he gets. So, if you're talking about like the truly elite defensemen in the NHL, the vast majority of them run their team's top power play unit and do so at a high level.
How about defensively?
I still think he's very good defensively. But when he was getting Norris Trophy votes a few years ago, it was because he was elite defense. Because he was like, I mean, there was a time where he was arguably the best defensive defenseman in the NHL. Like that happened. That's not revisionist history. That's not something we're making up. That wasn't undeserved. Like he earned that. He was playing like that. He is not playing at that level this year. I would say he probably didn't play at that level last year. So I'd say he's still very good defensively, but he's not the best defensive defenseman in the NHL right now.
So let me reword it, and I'm not trying to put you guys on the spot. I'm just trying to shoot the shit here. But another way people word this question would be, do you view these players as complementary pieces on a Stanley Cup team or pillars of a Stanley Cup team? And this question is something we don't know the answer to, but just going off of your gut, like do the Bruins get to where they want to go if these are their best players, or do they thrive when you have a good ensemble, like a Torrey Crew to move the puck, and obviously a center like Bergeron and a guy like Chara to help. Like when these guys are on an island, they don't thrive. And I'm sure that goes for a lot of star players. I'm sure an ensemble helps everybody, but it just seems as though there are certain top players in the league where they're able to get to their game with less more often than maybe these guys.
Well, to answer the question of if the Bruins get to the Stanley Cup, are these guys the pillars? They have to be. What kind of crazy shakeup would you have to do if not? Like just the contracts and everything. Like if these are not your pillars and you're just not a Stanley Cup team, basically for the next 5 years, based on it, you would have to do some really crazy maneuvering to make a Stanley Cup team built around other people besides Swayman, Pasternak, and McAvoy. Just contracts alone, never mind how hard it is to get the right value for certain players, make the right trades, and I just don't think it's possible. So like if you ask it that way, yeah, those guys are the pillars because the eggs are in those baskets. It's going to be hard to take them out and move them somewhere else. Should they have better complementary pieces that can take a few eggs out of the baskets? Like, yes, but you can't, like, there's too many, right now there's too much invested, right? So there's too much invested in those guys for them not to be your pillars. And that was the gamble that you take with any big contract. But anyway, Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, I think they can be pillars, but you have to have more around them. Like, just to draw a comparison to the Panthers, like were Alexander Barkov and Aaron Ekblad were the Panthers' two big players for years, for like a decade. Were those guys Stanley Cup pillars the whole time? Or do they become Stanley Cup pillars when you add Matthew Tkachuk and Sam Reinhart and Gustav Forsling around them? Like, those guys are still leaders of that team, but now there were other stars around them. Like, so, and I'm not saying like you need to get, 3 stars like that, but like you need more around them than what you have now. So I think Pasternak and McAvoy still have things to learn, and like obviously they're not the greatest leaders in the world yet. I still think I think they want to win. Like I think their hearts are in the right place. I think they care. I know there's people who don't think that about them. I would argue those are people who don't know them and have never taken any opportunity to get to know them. But yeah, like you can't expect them to do it alone with, one other top 6 forward on the team and one other top 4 defenseman. Like, no, you need like a much stronger roster.
I think the reason why we can kind of have this conversation about these two players though is when you bring up Barkov and Ekblad, like you're right, but for the longest time they didn't have that, and then we saw what happened when they did, and but we've seen a Bruins roster that has had this ensemble of supporting players with McAvoy and Pasternak. Like we've seen McAvoy and Pasternak go on playoff runs with help, and the team has fallen short. I'm not putting this on them. I'm just more so, guys. I'm just trying to have a conversation that has nothing to do with the Bruins' lack of scoring. I'm bored. Let's talk about something here.
We're all bored of having the same conversation that we've had throughout the 6-game losing streak. And the reason why you bring up McAvoy, we've covered Pasternak already. I feel like a few episodes, but like I feel like we haven't talked that much about McAvoy in that, like, in what he's looked like this year compared to in past years. And we've started to get a lot more comments about McAvoy on our videos. So I think it's something that's collectively being thought about more, talked about more. So I understand like this conversation, and I'd probably rather talk about this than the game because there really wasn't all that much to talk about from the game. So
Yeah, no, like, yeah, the game conversation is the same one. It feels like we've had, 20 times this year. Yeah, look, I mean, McAvoy needs to be better than he's been this season. So does Pasternak. Like, that's, yeah, like, there's no breaking news there. Um, I don't know. Like, I also come back to, again, like, he's played with what, 4 different partners at times this year. Yeah, he's getting paid to be the guy who can perform with anyone. Um, but I don't know, like, maybe at some point he just needs, like, obviously he had Grizzly for a long time. They were very good. Grizzlick's game falls off. McAvoy kind of goes with him a bit. Like, I think that's sort of what happened last year is, again, like, he didn't really have a great partner next to him pretty much all season. And I feel like you're seeing that again this year. Like, Zadorov hasn't been as good as they were hoping. Lorai hasn't stepped up enough to, like, kind of win that job. Hampus Lindholm's been injured, so you haven't even really had a chance to, even if you wanted to give a Lindholm McAvoy pairing a shot, like, that hasn't been an option. But yeah, I also just keep going back to, like, so much of this for these guys would look so much better, and we'd be having such a different conversation if they were even just league average on the power play. And the fact that they're so bad there and that McAvoy is doing a bad job quarterbacking it just continues to be the most baffling thing about this team to me, because sure, maybe they don't have enough talent on that power play unit to be one of the best in the league. There's enough there to be middle of the pack. And I just, like, I can't, maybe we'll find something out after the season or at some point. Like, I can't figure out why it's as bad as it is. And, like, why these guys who seemingly have good intentions and say the kind of things that, make it sound like they know what the problem is or they know what they have to do, and yet can just never do it.
Do you feel like, though, the comments over the last few games, they sound like they know what they need to do?
No.
Because
when you talk to David Pasternak about, or Brad Marchand about the power play, they talk about, we need to get more pucks to the net. We need second, third efforts to recover them. We need faster movement. Like, they say all the things that we all say, and then they don't do it.
Yeah, but I honestly talking about more of a general sense, like how to get out of the losing streak.
Well, Bridget, to your question, I mean, you heard Charlie Coyle after the Edmonton game. He has no answers. He honestly, he said it was embarrassing. It sounded like if you gave him some truth serum, or he was having a couple of beers off the record, he would probably be, telling you what's really going on there.
I would
Elias
love
Lindholm,
to get him off the record. I would love to get him, have had him off the record after that, because what he was saying, he was angry, and like if he could really have said who or what was going on behind the scenes, I'm sure we would have a better idea of what to talk about right now, because I think there are problem areas / maybe disconnections with certain players that we just don't see, and we won't know because they're not going to tell us. But if you were to take him aside and just have a beer with him, and you weren't a reporter or whatever, like, it would probably make a lot more sense than trying to go off comments that are more politically, not blaming certain people.
Well, yeah, and I was just specifically talking about the power play, but yeah, like in general, yeah, they don't have answers. We heard that after Tuesday's game. You can tell from the fact that they keep rolling out the same lineup tells you, like, the coaches don't have answers. Like, Jim Montgomery clearly didn't have answers before he got fired. I feel like we're now at a point where Joe Sacco doesn't have answers. Like, flipping Zadorov and Wotherspoon was the only lineup change for this game, and changing up the power play units. You've lost 5 in a row going in, and there's no real shakeup. There's no no change in the lines, no one
Well, it's
coming
the
in
mom's
and out.
trip.
No
It's the
one
mom's trip,
called
Scott.
up. No one called up. Like, I don't know. It's like he's like throwing his hands up. So that's where I look at it now, and I'm like, okay, if everyone else is like throwing their hands up and like we don't know what to do, now it's on Don Sweeney. Like, now it's time for him to act again in one way or another.
Scott, it's the mom's trip. You know, you can't put an optimal
Fine,
lineup or try to change things because it's a
play
mom's
the
trip.
moms. Put the
No,
moms
yeah,
in the
yeah.
lineup.
No, I heard that this week. Oh no, it's a mom's trip. You know, with all due respect, it's like it's a business. You got to do what's best on the ice. I mean, but whatever. I'm not going to go there.
Yeah, well,
Shout out
moms,
to
you
the
don't want
moms.
to. You don't want to fight the moms. Like,
No,
they get this extra strength when you mess with their
No.
kids. So
No, can't have Mama Wallstrom being mad at Sweeney. They call it Potter or Lysell, you know, God forbid, a guy that's been there 2 weeks. Yeah, I mean, look, the power play, I mean, so their last power play goal came on December 23rd. Okay, since then, they've gone 0 for 13 on the power play. Their opponents have actually gone 2 for 13 on Bruins power plays. So they're being outscored 2-0 on their own power play since before Christmas. So that's great. And then just on the season, Bridget and Scott, the Bruins, what did I say? So the Bruins have scored 1 goal or less in 13 of their 44 games this year. That's 30% of their games. They're scoring 1 goal or less. In that situation, Bridget and Scott, can somebody explain to me what is so good about this roster that they cannot make these changes? You know, bring up some call ups or just do something to get people on their toes and hear footsteps behind them for their job security. And I'll tell you one thing: if I'm Don Sweeney, I'll tell you what he's not going to do. He's not going to sell right now, because the second he starts to sell, he's signing away his job. That's my opinion. But you can try to make some hockey trades right now, and if they don't work out and this team keeps losing games and you get to February, like, then ownership needs to step in and make a GM change if the GM's not going to do what's right for the team and sell sell some pending UFAs. Like, you can't just allow this season. If this season starts to keep going, ass backwards, you cannot just ride it out and hope to, like, you got to do something. And obviously Sweeney's not going to actively try to concede the season at any point, because that means his job's going to be over. So ownership needs to, like, really take over their team if it gets to that point. I'm not saying it's there right now. I want to see what happens this month. But I think, to Scott's point last week, early February, we're going to know exactly what this team, I think, should do. The question is, if that answer is to sell away some pending UFAs and try to get something for them, is Sweeney willing to do it? I don't think he is, because we all know what that means for him.
If you mean get something for them by as in draft picks, then yeah, he's not going to do it. If you mean get something for them by, like, players that can help right now, then
anything. Draft collateral, freeing up cap space. Like, if the writing's on the wall and they're not postseason bound, and you kind of know that in, like, the first, second week of February, let's just call it by 4 nations. Like, I just think, I just don't think that Sweeney has the I don't know. I just don't see him doing it. I don't see him doing it, but he should.
Yeah.
I think now's the time to follow through on the threat that if you don't want to be here, you're going to be gone.
Yeah. I mean, like, this is like the conundrum I brought up on the last pod is what is ownership going to do? What are they going to allow Sweeney to do? Because you're right. Like, you can't go full seller mode and be like, oh, we're just looking to the future now. Unless ownership tells Sweeney, like, don't worry if we miss the playoffs this year. You'll have a chance to oversee this retool, which is an assurance I don't think they're going to give him, nor should they. So,
nor should he believe it if they do.
Yeah. So to Brian's point, it's like, so do you let Sweeney try to trade his way out of this? And I don't know. cling to a playoff spot or trade for someone with term. We've brought up Elias Pettersson, JT Miller. I wrote a column about them for weei.com on Thursday. Or does ownership put handcuffs on Sweeney and say, nope, this is the team you built. We're going to ride it out, and we'll see if we make the playoffs, and we'll revisit everything after.
I think that the second one that you just said is probably more likely.
Yeah, which is not what fans are going to like.
That's not what I would like. That's infuriating. Like
that's what they did to Peter Chiarelli at the end. Like, he couldn't do anything the final season. They missed the playoffs and he's gone.
Yeah, but the Chiarelli playoff misses, they were by like a point, and it was like I think both situations came down to the final week. If this Bruin again, like, I'm not saying it right now on January 9th, but we're gonna know a lot more in a month. Your famous words, Scott. If in a month's time this team on points percentage is 13th in the conference and 6th or 7th in the Atlantic, and then you got 4 nations, and you come back, and next thing you know, the deadline's right around the corner. You're not investing in this team. So, and if you're standing pat and you're keeping these UFAs for a pipe dream of becoming a wild card team and getting bounced in 5 games or 4 games, I mean, that is when fans have all the right in the world to be furious, because that is stubbornness from ownership to try to do everything that they can just to get 4 games in the playoffs in Boston, or 3 at least. And it's Sweeney trying to save his job. And I understand it. Everybody in this world looks out for themselves. But from a bird's eye perspective, like, that, to me, that is just a complete mismanagement of your employees from the Jacobs on their behalf. And it's a mismanagement of priorities, because what they care about is the short-term dollar and playoff revenue, and they don't care about the long-term success or short-term success of the Bruins. The Bruins would be a much better team next year if they're out of the playoffs in a month by a good amount. They could be right back at it next year if they manage their pending UFAs properly and get stuff for them, and then they have the cap space in the summer.
Yeah, I would just point out that if you put the handcuffs on Sweeney, that works both ways. It also would be to prevent him from trading future assets to bring someone in this year and try to make the playoffs in a season that they're probably not going deep anyways. Like, that it goes. So yes, you're probably not allowing Sweeney to make like a shake up look into the future, but you're also preventing him from trading away from the future for him to just try to cling to his job by making the playoffs and adding a rental or whatever. Now, like, you're also preventing him from doing that. So it goes both ways. Like, it's literally just a stand pat strategy, see how the season goes, and then regroup in the off season. And if we've missed the playoffs, then it's probably with the new GM.
Yeah, well, and I want to wrap this soon because we're recording late and I'm very tired, but I do think it's really difficult, as much as it makes sense to us, Brian, like what you were just saying. It's difficult to really like extrapolate what ownership is going to be doing, like, to a complex level, because these are guys with a lot of money. I'm sure they have consultants that, tell them what to do, but like, do you really think that they're thinking it on the kind of level that Scott's just explaining? Like, that's what I don't know. Like, are they really looking into it like, okay, if they got Elias Pettersson now, then they'll be set up for several years, but like, maybe we shouldn't spend our assets on it because it might not pan out. Like, I just don't think they think it at that level. Like, it's a complicated thing. And that's why I think that they're much more likely to just ride out to the end of the season with what Sweeney's going to do and trust him with it. And if he fails, he fails, and they just replace him, because I just don't really know. Like, these are guys that own, like, Delaware North is a big company and they own a lot of things, and how much they really want to get into the weeds and think about individual players, I don't know. Like, in assets, it's like, it's really difficult to know how much they pay attention, because we don't get to talk to them that much. And when we do talk to them, we don't go, hey, do you think that Elias Pettersson would have been a good addition. Like, that's just not the kind of questions that we ask. I don't know how deep it goes. Scott, you look like you have an opinion about.
Well, no, all I was going to add is that really, ultimately, like what that comes down to is, do they still have full faith in Cam Neely? Because generally, the Jacobs have been, for as long as Cam Neely has been president of the team, they've been very hands-off on hockey decisions because they love Cam Neely and they trust him. So if he's in line with the GM, then they're good with the GM. And if Cam Neely says it's time to change the GM, they approve a change of the GM. So do they still believe in Neely? And what does Neely want to do? And how does he view this? Because we know he's had doubts about Sweeney before. He let Sweeney go through a lame duck season 3 years ago. Sweeney went through the season without an extension beyond the year. He got extended after the season. So we know there's been doubts in the past. Are there now? I would think there's got to be some to some extent.
All I know, guys, is it's really not that complicated how they should go about the rest of the season. Barring a JT Miller or Elias Pettersson type trade, I think what they should do is because right now they're going the safe route by having these NHL players in the roster, and all it's getting them is the worst offense in the league, the worst power play in the league, one of the worst plus minuses in the league, and they're a non-playoff team, and they're a bottom third team in the league. So if you're going to be that team, you might as well do it with some younger players in the lineup. So they should call up a couple of players from Providence, call it Poch or Lysell. If in a month's time you're out of the playoffs, okay, fine. You're out of the playoffs now anyway. And if you're in the playoffs, then go spend a 5th round pick or a 3rd round pick on a middle 6 guy at the deadline and go have your playoff run if you can. But I don't think it has to be that complicated. Like, you're either going to know in a month's time if you're a playoff, potential team. If you are, try to add a middle 6 forward for a cheap cost. If you're not, either way, they should bring up some kids. And then if you're not a playoff team, just don't re-sign some pending UFAs and see what you can get for them. And then to come back next year, hopefully a strong team again. Or not again, because they're not that great of a team right now. But you get my point. It doesn't have to, I'm not saying this has to be a long, this could be a turnaround next year. But you have to optimize and properly manage your assets and your players. And, we'll see if they do that. It obviously depends on how the next month goes, in my opinion. But anyway, Bridget, I know you got some editing to do. So again, I just want to plug that next week we're going to do a mailbag episode. So please send your questions here on YouTube. Email us at theskatepod@weei. What is it, Scott? Skatepod?
Skatepod@weei.com.
Yeah, I don't know why that always trips me up.
Twitter at the skatepod.
There you go. Thanks, Bridget. Okay. Enjoy Bruins Panthers over the weekend, and then Bruins Lightning again, round 2 shortly thereafter. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you soon. Hey guys, thanks for watching the Skate Podcast. If you want to see more of our videos, visit our playlist.
Not in front of a screen? You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Don't forget to follow us on social media. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment.